Hi, I'm Nathan, and today we're going to be discussing what makes a good stat system. We'll be going over examples of what makes a good and bad stat system in both tabletop games and video games alike, along with how I implemented these concepts into my game Soul. To start, what am I talking about when I say stat system? I'm talking about games that have base stats that affect your character at a core level, such as strength, stamina, agility, intelligence, etc., and so on and so forth. These stats in turn affect a character's ability to perform actions directly, or often indirectly, by affecting other stats that in turn affect their actions. It's all very complicated. Dungeons & Dragons is a great example, with the primary stats affecting each skill, giving them bonuses. For instance, someone with a high intelligence also gains a bonus to their arcana. So, now that we're on the same page, what makes a good stat system? Well, to answer that question, I like to answer another question. Does a game even need a stat system? No, it doesn't. Next question. No, but seriously, they don't. But they do help add character diversity to a game at its base level. When originally making Soul, there was some debate whether we should have a stat system at all. At the time, I was taking a lot of inspiration from U-Realms Live, which had no core stats. This sort of game allows for a lot of freedom and simplicity. In U-Realms' case, a character was built solely on their cards in their hand, with no stats to affect their dice rolls. This meant a character couldn't excel at anything that wasn't listed on their cards. Conversely, a game with a stat system allows a character to have innate strengths and weaknesses. For example, Dungeons & Dragons allows a character with high strength to deal more damage with their melee weapon compared to a character that doesn't. So is it better to have a stat system than not? Well, it depends on its integration into the game, which is also the answer to our question of what makes a good stat system. A game with a well-integrated stat system allows it to influence the entirety of the play experience, while allowing for each stat to be just as important as the others. Let's take a look at a game that failed to have a good integration of its system to see what I mean. Diablo 3. Diablo 3 has 3 core stats: strength, dexterity, and intelligence. These stats granted damage for each of their respected classes and were called primary stats. For example, Monk's primary stat was dexterity, and Wizard's was intelligence. Each of these core stats will grant defensive stats as well, such as strength granting armor, dexterity granting dodge chance, and intelligence granting resistances. This is all pretty standard for a game like this, but the real problem arose in the actual application of these mechanics. Due to it granting both damage and damage reduction, having a primary stat for a class was just much better, rather than just obtaining damage reduction from a secondary stat. Additionally, many types of damage reduction could simply be found from other sources such as items or abilities. To further accentuate the problem, the game was built around the importance of killing enemies as quickly as possible, making more damage the clear choice over defense. Your enemies can't kill you if they're dead. This clearly made your primary stat the logical choice. Whenever an item would roll with a different stat, it felt underwhelming, and would often lead to the player re-rolling the stat or not using it at all. Eventually, an update to the game made it so items no longer rolled without your primary stat, making core stats effectively useless. At this point, they may as well lumped all the stats together into a single stat that grants you damage and defense. The biggest takeaway from this example is that each of the stats should have uses for every character. Obviously, they try to do this with various damage reduction stats, however, they ended up not being as useful as a character gaining benefits from their primary one. But you might be saying, this is how games have been made for years. Each class has a stat they specialize in. A warrior specializes in strength, a rogue with dexterity, and a wizard with intelligence. The problem with this system is that if you only base a character around one of these stats, you'll never get interesting characters like a battle mage with a sword in one hand and a spell in the other, or a pirate with the nimbleness of a rogue and the strength of a warrior. Definitely not trying to knock the game, because I've put way too many hours into it myself, but it's something good to acknowledge and ultimately understand that core stats aren't always necessary. I feel as if when creating the game, the developers added it because it felt like something this sort of game should have, and not because it actually made the game better. Or maybe it's because it's hard to tell if these stats are even necessary until the game's actually finished. Or maybe they even got outgrown as the game evolved around them. Soul experienced many of the same problems itself. When the game was first released, we had items and abilities that added stat points to characters, typically around 5 to 10 points to whatever stat. The problem with the scaling of Soul is that most stats needed 10 points to actually give you a bonus. For example, for every 10 strength, the character would gain +1 melee damage, or for every 10 agility, a player would gain +1 to their roll for range weapons. Meaning, items that granted core stats would grant at best +1 to whatever subsequent stat, or at worst, literally do nothing if it didn't get the player over the 10-point threshold. Adding base stats was cool, but ultimately less effective than just buffing the stat that the core stats ultimately affects. As you can see, we started running into the same problems as Diablo 3. We may as well have just had items that grant 10 strength, grant +1 melee damage, or similar for other stats. And that's exactly what we did, which led us to come up with this design philosophy. The game was allowed to be complex in character creation, or when not actively in a session, as long as it was simplistic during gameplay. Upon coming up with this design philosophy, we removed abilities and items that granted additional stat points. In addition to these stats not feeling necessary, they also required you to do some calculations which slow down the game. Unfortunately, this just pushed core stats further into irrelevance. So can this design philosophy not work while having good core stats feel relevant? I think that definitely isn't the case, and to show you, let me introduce you to a game you've likely never heard of. Or if you have, you certainly never played. Anarchy Online. This game is a bit of a hidden gem when it comes to game design in my opinion, for multiple reasons, but let's focus on the stat system for today. Anarchy has lots of stats, and I mean a lot, but it's truthfully one of its greatest strengths. Anarchy's core stats, called abilities, have a trickle-down effect on subsequent skills. For instance, body development, or the game's health stat, is 100% affected by stamina. Stats can also be affected by abilities in different percentages as well. The time-space alteration stat, which is used for what are essentially spells, is affected 80% by intelligence and 20% by agility. So why is this important? Well, different gear and abilities require a different number of stat points to use. Additionally, whereas most games would have a level cap for specific items, Anarchy does not, allowing you to equip items higher level than your own as long as you have the right gear and are smart enough to do it. Let's say I want to equip a shotgun that's much higher level than I am. I can start by raising my shotgun stat, but that might not be enough, so upgrading the abilities that affect it are the next logical step. Agility affects it by 60% and strength by 40%, but that still might not be enough. So I can take a look at my implants, a set of wearable items that buff my stats as well. The right arm implant typically buffs shotgun skills, so maybe I can get one of those on. Well, those require agility, which I've already raised, but it also requires treatment. So maybe my treatment is too low, which is ultimately affected by intelligence, so maybe I can raise that and, well, you get the point. All the stats are extremely well integrated, allowing them each to affect each other, on top of letting gear be equipped at any level. This allows for tons of fun trying to squeeze out that one stat point to get that piece of gear on. I've probably spent an equal amount of time in that game sitting in the shop working on my character as I have actually playing the game. The stat system allows for diverse gameplay by allowing a player to grind their way through the game by leveling up, or by using their intelligence to work the system to get better that way. So if this sort of design philosophy works in Anarchy, why doesn't it work in Soul? Well, for one, people aren't computers. And by that, I mean a computer is going to have a much easier time calculating this sort of thing in a video game than a person would in a board game. We attempted to solve this problem by using spreadsheets, but if you're using a spreadsheet to play a card game, you're probably doing something wrong. Additionally, a game that is complicated during character creation is not very friendly to new players. Part of the idea of Soul being card-based was that you could easily pick up some cards and make a character. Complicated stats like these aren't conductive to that. This can be seen heavily in Anarchy. I've tried to get a few of my friends to play the game, and let's just say the barrier to entry is just a little too high. And lastly, Soul wasn't designed to work like this. The items don't generally affect stats, and even when they did, there wasn't enough there to make it interesting like it was in Anarchy. On top of that, the gear's requirements in Soul aren't nearly as particular, so the process of getting on higher level gear just wasn't the same. Not to mention, gear didn't actually have any levels, so yeah. So if this doesn't work for our game, what then? Well, there's another game that had similar problems that we can take a look at, which should provide some insight as well. One of the biggest games of all time, League of Legends. Back in the early days of League, they had the rune system. This system allowed you to buy runes to grant you minor stat bonuses in the game. Well, this was a decent idea and never really had enough impact for novice players to even notice. Additionally, it didn't really add any sort of enjoyment to the game. Who really cares about a stat bonus of +9 armor? At the same time, the game also had another system, Masteries, which, while still not great, had some more interesting stuff going for it, like providing stats that you couldn't get anywhere else in game, such as allowing buffs to last longer, allowing your skills to apply a burn, or even a consumable item that you got at the start of the game. The developers decided to lean harder into these kinds of benefits and combine both systems, making their new rune system. Their new rune system had very few abilities compared to both their old systems having, well, tons, lowering the number of runes a player could take and making each one more impactful, such as Aftershock, which after immobilizing an enemy grants you armor and magic resist. Then, after a short duration, it releases a shockwave, dealing damage based on your maximum health and magic damage, allowing for players who value engaging hard into a fight to benefit from this ability. The core of this change is that fewer, more impactful bonuses are better than many less impactful ones. Soul's scaling with its core stats was nice for diversity, however, say a character that exclusively used guns was completely unaffected by strength. And unlike a stat system in Dungeons & Dragons, our stats didn't have modifiers to add to rolls that aren't related to a specific skill. For instance, if you wanted to arm wrestle a character at a local tavern in D&D, you could simply add your strength modifier. Soul didn't have this. It did have a few systems that had beneficial scaling for each class, such as agility granting movement distance, but most other skills felt lacking. Out of our stats, we had reworked the endurance stat the most, around 5 times before finally finding a solution. Endurance mainly granted a character health for every point, but also additional benefits for every 10 points. Originally, the benefit was gaining +1 to dice rolls dealing with heavy weapons. This was to go along with the fantasy of a tanky brute character wielding very large weapons. However, this ended up not feeling as intuitive and somewhat redundant, with heavy weapons already having a stat requirement. In the next iteration, we changed it to allow players to reduce damage by rolling. Unfortunately, when implemented, the system's rules were not thought out. Endurance gave +1 on rolls to damage reduction per 10 endurance. How high of a roll did a player need to get? Was the number chosen by the game master? Or did it matter what the attack roll was against them? And how much damage reduction did it apply? Is it the amount of armor the character had? For that matter, why didn't this change just grant the character +1 armor, a system we already had in place? Essentially, we had no system in place for this, and it was just, the stat itself that was the rule. I don't know. I'll be honest, I do like the idea, but this was not fleshed out at all and haphazardly thrown together, so it ended up being scrapped for the next bonus. That bonus came in patch 1.1 when we reworked the shield mechanic. Endurance now gave a small damage shield at 5 endurance. At the start of every combat, a player would gain +1 shield with no regen for every point they had. Once depleted, the shield would not regenerate even if the player had full stamina. So essentially the player would gain a singular temporary health point for every 5 points of endurance they had, which looking back at it was extremely underwhelming and really not fun at all. You're already gaining 1 actual point of stamina for each point of endurance, so gaining 1 temporary one just wasn't good. Needless to say, we couldn't find the right balance for these stats, endurance just being one of them. We weren't able to make these stats feel useful for multiple playstyles, let alone fun to acquire. This is when we found the solution: the trait system. A skill tree system of sorts, allowing for players to pick what bonuses they wanted for their character from cards. For every 5 stat points, a player would be able to pick from one of these cards for each tree: strength, agility, intelligence, and endurance. Within these trees, there were 5 subcategories: might, precision, fortitude, vigor, and focus. Each one of these played to a different playstyle. Might played toward close-range fighters, precision generally aided accuracy, fortitude played toward durability of characters, vigor was meant to center around support roles and aid in things like healing and mobility. Focus worked more with ability users, allowing them to use more abilities or gain different bonuses for those abilities. While Tier 1 abilities would generally provide small stat bonuses like they did in the original system, such as Aggressive in the Strength tree, granting +1 melee damage, the Tier 5 abilities would allow for more powerful effects, such as allowing a character to dual-wield weapons with no penalty at all, or range attacks never miss unless you critically fail. Additionally, a melee character who happened to have intelligence could take a trait like Tactical, which allowed them to move 1 space after attacking, allowing for a character to benefit from all the core stats in one way or another. But what's most important is that even though the system's not perfect, it really allowed for our stats to be much better integrated into the game. Stats became relevant and useful by removing small stat bonuses and putting more impactful ones in their place, allowing for a much more fun and immersive experience. This ended up solving most of our problems, but it still isn't perfect. Firstly, each subcategory doesn't reach Tier 5, meaning each playstyle doesn't fully benefit from each stat. This was fixed in the unreleased version 2 of Soul, along with providing more tailored subcategories for each stat, and there's still the problem of these stats not being relevant for roleplay-based activities, like in the aforementioned arm wrestling in D&D. The system will probably end up being reworked again in the next version, but we'll cross that bridge when we get there. Anyway, I hope this helped you learn something about stat systems and the importance of integrating them well into your game, along with whether they're even important to have at all. If you want to learn more about Soul, please check out our website at soulrpg.com. Thanks for joining me, and I'll see you in the next one.